Okay, Dr. Osborne is back. We had some technical difficulties, so hopefully now you can hear me. If you can, I'd like to just get a quick attendance of the room, and if you can hear me, just raise your hand or fill out the chat box. Let me know. Let me know that you can hear me. Okay, again, if you can hear me, just kind of chime in and let me know. What do we got, Sally? Do we have any responses coming in? Okay.
Picture but no sound.
Let me know if you can hear me. Picture but no sound. Okay. Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. Again, if you can hear me, let me know. I want to get started. And okay, if you can hear and see me, excellent. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Sorry for the technical delay. That's sometimes the internet can throw a little curve in our plans. So thanks for your patience. So tonight we're going to start talking about some of the concepts out of the book, No Grain, No Pain. And pretty much the biggest concept that I want to cover with you guys is the concept of the causation of autoimmune disease. It's the #1 condition in the United States. There's more than 46 million people diagnosed with autoimmunity. There's more than 100 million people that are suspected to have autoimmunity, and it is absolutely the #1 cause of death in the U.S., despite statistics claiming that cancer and heart disease kill more people. Autoimmune disease combined kills more than any other form of condition. So something near and dear to my heart, and so I want to share with you what you should be looking for in a doctor and what you should be looking for in terms of trying to figure out why the condition exists, as opposed to having a doctor tell you you have this condition, tell you that it's not your fault, tell you that you're going to have to take medications for the rest of your life to manage the condition. That's just not realistic. You shouldn't be on medication for the rest of your life. So let's talk first about the 4 causes of autoimmune disease. There's only 4, and they're actually quite simple and they're quite easy to measure. So the first cause of autoimmunity, it was discovered first originally in 1952, is actually gluten. And gluten was discovered originally to cause celiac disease, which is a form of autoimmune disease of the intestine. But we know today, after years and years of research, that gluten can trigger and cause multiple forms of autoimmune disease. Now, understand that gluten is in a category, it's not in a category of itself, but gluten is in the category of autoimmune causes that I call food. In other words, gluten is not the only thing that can cause autoimmune disease in the food category. There are certainly other foods that can trigger or contribute to autoimmunity. So category #1 is gluten. Category #2, very simply, chemicals. And this could be pesticides, this could be herbicides, fungicides, heavy metals, this can be dyes, colors, food additives, you name it. There are a number of different studies showing and relating chemical exposure to triggering of autoimmune conditions. So again, food and chemicals, #1 and 2. #3 is infection. There are a number of different forms of bacteria, viruses, yeast and mold, as well as parasitic infections that have been shown to cause or trigger autoimmune disease as well. So that puts infection in category #3. And then the last is vitamin and mineral deficiencies. Your body needs vitamins and minerals. As a matter of fact, this is why nutrition should be a fundamental science in medical school. It's not, but it should be. And that vitamin and mineral deficiency, realize your body's only made of 7 things. It's made out of fats, carbs, proteins, vitamins, minerals, water, and nucleic acids. These are the fundamental structural building blocks that your body needs to maintain health and to repair and to build new tissue. And there are a number of different vitamins and minerals that have been shown when deficient to contribute to autoimmune disease. Probably the most well studied is vitamin D deficiency. But then we also have other nutrient deficiencies that can trigger autoimmunity. Asparagine, which is an amino acid. Zinc can play a role in autoimmunity. Vitamin C deficiency can play a role in autoimmunity. So again, if we categorize the 4 fundamental reasons why autoimmune disease can exist in the first place, we've got gluten or other foods, we've got chemicals, we've got infections, and we've got vitamin and mineral deficiency. So understanding that is crucial, especially if you've been diagnosed with an autoimmune condition, because if your doctor's medicating you but your doctor's not investigating these 4 fundamental pieces, then it's probably time to move on and find a doctor who's willing to investigate those things. So that is, if you take anything away from tonight's message, I want you to take away that knowledge, because that knowledge is super, super critical as you move forward trying to find an answer or solution. Now, I'd like to also ask a question tonight. I want to go ahead and put up a poll. Just a simple question. I want to ask how many of you are actually gluten-free? So coming into tonight's talk, how many of you have already gone gluten-free or put yourself on a gluten-free diet? And if you'll go ahead and just punch in the answer for me, and we'll get some feedback. Now, as you're filling that poll out, as you're giving us that feedback and giving us an answer, I'm going to talk a little bit about gluten. You know, traditionally, gluten has been referred to as a protein found in wheat, barley, and rye. But gluten is not only found in wheat, barley, and rye. Gluten is a protein, but more specifically, gluten is a family of proteins found within the seeds of grass. So gluten, gluten is actually a plural term. Glutens would be a more appropriate term to use, because there's not just one form of gluten. There are over 1,000 forms of identified gluten that we know of, at least to date. There may be more than that, but there's at least that many forms. And so when we're talking about the gluten-free diet, most people who are following a gluten-free diet are avoiding wheat, barley, and rye. Now, some people will also look at oats and avoid oats, but the vast majority of people believe that oats are gluten-free, especially if the oats on the package say certified gluten-free oats. So these 3 grains, wheat, barley, and rye, were initially identified to contain a form of gluten, and this study was actually done in 1952. Before we knew what caused celiac disease, there was a German physician and during World War II who was treating children with celiac disease. And when World War II occurred, there was a grain ration, and so grains were not available to these children to eat in the hospital. So all of them with celiac disease had spontaneous recovery. And William Dickey was the name of this physician. He's the first doctor that made that observation and wrote a paper on it, published that paper in 1952. And shortly after that, a group of researchers in Alabama at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, discovered a particular type of gluten, and that type of gluten was called alpha gliadin or alpha gliadin. Now, alpha gliadin is only found in wheat, barley, and rye. And so that's kind of what happened initially, is that we decided that gluten was going to be a term really meaning alpha gliadin, not really meaning gluten. Remember, alpha gliadin is only one form of gluten found in wheat, barley, and rye. Wheat by itself has more than 400 different forms of gluten. And so there are a lot of different kinds of gluten. Alpha gliadin, though, is the one that is being referred to when you read a food label. So if something says that this is gluten-free, it doesn't mean that it's truly gluten-free. It means that it's alpha gliadin-free, meaning it has no wheat, barley, and rye, down to 20 parts per million. So understand that gluten is actually a family of proteins. Gluten is not just alpha gliadin. And that being said, other grains contain glutens too, just different kinds of glutens. Some grains, like corn, for example, has different forms of gluten. Rice has different forms of gluten. Sorghum has different forms of gluten. Millet has different forms of gluten. And so what happens is a lot of people initially going on a gluten-free diet think they're on a gluten-free diet, but they're really just on a wheat, barley, rye-free diet, and they're still consuming some of these other grains that contain some of these other forms of glutens. And the kicker is that a lot of these other forms of gluten have been shown to create inflammatory damage and autoimmune disease just as severely as this alpha gliadin. As a matter of fact, in 2010, a group of Australian researchers discovered 400 new gluten proteins. 40 of them were more toxic than alpha gliadin, and they were not just isolated to wheat. So again, alpha gliadin is only one form of gluten. It's the form of gluten on a food label that gluten-free refers to. And I want you to understand that, because many of you may be following what you think is a gluten-free diet and still struggling to overcome pain, still struggling to overcome autoimmune disease, hormone disruption, etc., and just not hitting the mark because you're still eating those gluten-free products, you're still eating the corn, you're still eating the rice. So that being said, you know, I polled you before we explained that, and everybody in the audience. So here are our results. 52% of you said that you were gluten-free or following a gluten-free diet. So now I'm going to re-ask that question. I want to go ahead and close that poll and reset it and ask that question again. And go ahead and fill out for me now, based on this definition of gluten that we just talked about, being gluten being found in all grains. How many of you are actually following a gluten-free diet? And so I'll give you a few minutes to plug in that answer, because I'd like to see if we have the same type of statistical numbers coming back as we did in that first poll. So again, I think it was, what was it, 52% were on a gluten-free diet before? So yeah, 53%. So we're definitely getting a different feedback that's coming in on this second poll, meaning that many of you probably just learned something that you could take away tonight and hopefully obtain a better degree of health as a result of following what you're learning. So, you know, we're going to leave that poll up there for a few more minutes, and we're going to also take just a quick break. I want to let that sink in for just a minute, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a video for you. I want to share a story with you about one of my patients. And this particular patient had severe nerve damage, had something called ascending paralysis, and I want to talk a little bit about how gluten plays a role as a neurotoxin and can trigger nerve damage. Okay, so again, just like to share those types of stories with you. Some of you might be extremely sick and just looking for hope, and I want you to know that there's definitely hope if you apply the right diet and apply the right intelligence and apply the right willpower to this process. Then autoimmune disease is something that you can definitely overcome. So, as pulling up that poll question, so initially, the vast majority of you answered that you thought you were on a gluten-free diet. I think it was 62%. The second poll comes back. We've got 41% of you after going through that explanation. So again, a number of you thought you were gluten-free, but now you realize that you weren't. And so let's think about how you can apply that as you go forward into the future. Now, I'm going to start answering some of the questions that are coming in. I'd like to take some time for that. So probably one of the biggest questions rolling in right now is about quinoa. Is quinoa safe? Quinoa is what we would technically consider not a grain. It's a pseudo grain. It is a seed, but it isn't a seed of grass, so it's not in the grain family. But studies show there was a couple of studies done. One was done in 2012, showed that there were a couple of different proteins in quinoa that actually mimicked gluten close enough that quinoa would actually create an inflammatory response in those with gluten sensitivity. So it's not a food that I recommend using as a substitute, especially if you're still struggling and you're already on a traditional gluten-free diet, meaning a diet that's only free, wheat, barley, and rye, and you're struggling, but you're using quinoa and rice and corn as staple foods in your diet. That there's probably a good reason that you're struggling is because you're still eating those other foods that can also look like gluten, mimic gluten, and create problems very, very similar to gluten. Let's get to some more questions here. And if I mispronounce your name, just going to have to forgive me. Madhu asks, is the gluten in rice as problematic as alpha-gliadin? And the answer to that is, for the most part, yes. The difference between the gluten in rice and the gluten in wheat is concentration more than anything else. Wheat, by concentration, the quantity of gluten found in wheat, the quantity of gluten is about, as far as the protein content is concerned, gluten is about 70% of the total protein of wheat, whereas in rice it's much lower, it's 5%. But rice actually has a couple of other really dangerous problems, Madhu, that you want to make sure that you're also aware of. One of those is rice is high in heavy metals, and particularly the two types of heavy metal. And this has actually been studied and researched extremely well. Cadmium and arsenic are two heavy metals that, if you're eating a lot of rice, you're getting exposure to these. Now, the problem with getting exposure to cadmium and arsenic, and if you go back to what I talked about at the beginning of this conversation tonight, is there's 4 known causes of autoimmune disease. And that second category I gave you were chemicals. Well, some of those chemicals are heavy metals. So cadmium and arsenic found in rice can actually continue to, even again, it has nothing to do with gluten, but it has to do with cadmium and arsenic triggering autoimmunity. And cadmium and arsenic can also interfere with hormones and create a lot of other types of dysfunction. So you don't want to consume a staple food that has one of the 4 elements that we know can trigger autoimmune disease. So even if rice were technically gluten-free, which it is not, you still would probably want to avoid it, primarily due to the high cadmium and arsenic concentration. Now, one of the other problems with rice has to do with the huge quantity of pesticide being used to grow it. Rice grows in water, and so a lot of the pesticide, even if the rice is an organic crop, a lot of the chemicals in the environment, in the air, they get into that groundwater, and so the way rice grows, it tends to pull in a lot of heavy toxic chemicals. So just not a food I would recommend that you eat. It's definitely not gluten-free, but again, it also has some of these other components that you don't want to make sure that you want to make sure that you're not consuming on a regular basis. Okay, let's check some other questions here. Okay, so Peggy's asking, what are my thoughts on buckwheat? Buckwheat falls under the same category as quinoa. It's known as a pseudograin. Now, there's 3 different types of pseudograin that are commonly called gluten-free and commonly used as gluten-free substitutes that you want to know about. One is quinoa, which we've discussed already. One is amaranth, and the other is buckwheat. So one of the problems with buckwheat and amaranth, the two of the biggest problems with them, one is the proteins in them can still mimic gluten. But two, a lot of those products that are packaged are actually processed in facilities that also process other grains. And even though they may say certified gluten-free, remember that by definition, certified gluten-free doesn't mean gluten-free. Certified gluten-free means that it's certified to be free of wheat, barley, and rye. But a lot of these pseudo grains, okay, are manufactured in facilities that also manufacture rice and corn and sorghum and some of the other grains that are going to contain gluten. So as a matter of fact, a study done, I think it was done in 2010, showed that, actually it's 2011, that showed that 41% of packaged, processed, quote unquote, gluten-free food actually was cross-contaminated with enough gluten to create problems. And there's a perfect example that happened just a couple of months ago. Cheerios was boasting a gluten-free Cheerios cereal. And not only are oats not gluten-free, so technically it's a misnomer anyway, but the reality was that the product was cross-contaminated with wheat. So they had to do a huge product recall. I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 million boxes had to be recalled because they were cross-contaminated with wheat. So even though oats aren't technically gluten-free, and they're being called gluten-free because of the definition, but even beyond those things, the oats were still contaminated with wheat, so they still posed a problem. And this is the problem people with gluten sensitivity face. They face this problem because every time you buy a packaged food or a processed food, you run that risk of cross-contamination of wheat, barley, rye, corn, rice, and other grains, because a lot of these packaged substitute gluten-free foods are either those grains themselves or are packaged in the same manufacturing facility, so there's a high risk and a high degree of potential for cross-contamination. So if you're one of those who's truly super sensitive, even at lower doses to some of these grains, you can really run into a long-term chronic autoimmune problem that just will not recover or repair. Remember, the dose of gluten that's required to cause damage is very, very small. The scientifically agreed upon level is 20 parts per million. Now, what does that equate to? 20 parts per million is the size of a breadcrumb. 20 parts per million is 1 drop of water in a gallon of water. That's how small 20 parts per million is. And that amount of gluten has been shown to create an inflammatory response for up to 2 months. So if you're getting that much exposure on a consistent basis once a week, so some of you answered that poll and said that you were gluten-free sometimes. Understand that if you're gluten-free sometimes, you're getting an inflammatory response with every exposure that can last up to 2 months. So if you're feeling better but not healthy, that's probably the reason why. Okay. Many professionals believe there is bad gluten and good gluten. No, I don't believe that there's bad and good gluten. I believe that there's bad gluten if you're gluten sensitive, and I believe that gluten's not a problem if you're not gluten sensitive. If you are gluten sensitive, and so let's talk about that for a moment, because the lab testing that's done to help diagnose gluten sensitivity, for a lot of people, they go through the kind of the traditional medical gambit, and that consists of a blood test, and it consists of an intestinal biopsy. So if you go to the GI doctor and you say, hey, I need you to test me for gluten, they won't test you for gluten sensitivity. They'll test you for celiac disease. And it's important to understand, and we're going to abbreviate here, gluten sensitivity is not the same thing as celiac disease. Everyone with celiac disease has gluten sensitivity, but not everybody with gluten sensitivity will develop celiac disease. Gluten sensitivity causes different diseases: rheumatoid arthritis, hypothyroid disease, or Hashimoto's. Gluten sensitivity can cause fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome. Gluten sensitivity has been linked to diabetes. It's been linked to something called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is a form of autoimmune liver disease. So gluten sensitivity itself isn't a disease, but it can cause disease. So if you are gluten sensitive and you're eating gluten, then the side effect of eating that gluten over time is chronic inflammation that then leads to a variety of different types of diseases. Not everybody's going to react to gluten in the exact same way. Now, Some people develop celiac disease. And the problem here is that a lot of doctors try to use gluten sensitivity and celiac disease as if they use them as interchangeable terms. In other words, they say, oh, you don't have celiac disease, therefore you're not gluten sensitive, therefore you can eat gluten. And it's an incorrect, it's an incorrect piece of information. In actuality, the test for celiac disease, the gold standard is a biopsy of your small intestine, and what the doctor is looking for is something called villus atrophy. Now, villus atrophy is a flattening of the little folds in the intestine, and when those flatten out, you develop malabsorption and severe gastrointestinal wasting. And that, understand though, a biopsy, when we take a biopsy, it's equivalent to taking a microscopic piece of the small intestine and assuming that that really tiny microscopic piece of the small intestine is a representation of the entire intestinal lining, and it's just not. Think of your intestines like a tennis court, because that's the surface area of your small intestine. It's as large as a tennis court. And so imagine picking up a very tiny pebble on that tennis court and saying that this pebble represents the entire tennis court. It doesn't. That's what a biopsy is. So a biopsy comes back oftentimes with a negative result. And when a biopsy is negative, it doesn't mean negative. If a biopsy is positive, it definitely means positive. But if a biopsy is negative, it doesn't mean you don't have celiac disease. It just means that where the doctor picked the sample of tissue, that particular area didn't have the damage that we look at and recognize as celiac disease. So understand that particular test, it has a high tendency to come back falsely negative. Now, the other type of testing for, again, for celiac disease, okay, is a blood test called anti-tissue transglutaminase. There's another one called anti-mycel antibody. And those tests are specific for celiac disease because they help to detect the villus atrophy or the villus flattening in the small intestine. But again, many people come back with negative test results even though they have gluten sensitivity, because the way gluten is affecting them is by causing a different kind of a disease, not by causing celiac disease. So again, if the doctor's measuring celiac disease, that's where it's the most important to understand. If the doctor's measuring celiac disease and the test comes back negative, it only means that he can't detect celiac disease. It doesn't mean that you're not gluten sensitive. So all that being said, and I'm going to get back to finish the question of good and bad glutens, but I want to take you down this road because I think it's important for you to understand that. All that being said, if celiac disease is not the same thing as gluten sensitivity, but gluten sensitivity can cause celiac disease among other diseases, how then do we go about finding out whether or not we are supposed to be following a gluten-free diet? And the answer is really quite simple. This is a white blood cell that I'm drawing for you. And on the surface of our white blood cell, we have these antennas. These antennas, look like a Y-based structure, and their job is to help your body, your immune system, identify things that are good versus things that are bad. And so what happens is in your DNA, on chromosome number 6, there are 2 genes. There's an HLA-DQ alpha-1 gene, and there's an HLA-DQ beta-1 gene. These 2 genes are responsible for building this antenna, for building that Y-shaped structure. And so the alpha-1 gene is this arm right here. Okay, this is alpha-1. The alpha-1 gene makes that piece. And the beta-1 gene makes the rest of it. Okay, makes this piece right here. So you've got this antenna. What happens if you have gluten-sensitive genes and you eat gluten, then gluten comes into contact with that antenna, and the normal outcome of that contact is inflammation. In other words, the immune system looks at gluten and says, we don't like this stuff. Let's get rid of it. Let's attack it. Let's shoot missiles at it. Let's shoot bombs at it. Let's make sure that it can't get to us. And so this is the outcome. So a person with gluten-sensitive genes, again, the only way we really determine that is by measuring the HLA-DQ alpha-1 and HLA-DQ beta-1 genotypes. The person with gluten-sensitive genes, their normal response to gluten exposure is going to be inflammation. And that inflammation If it's in the intestine, it can lead to an autoimmune condition called celiac disease. But if it's in your muscle, it can lead to the autoimmune condition called fibromyalgia. If it's getting into your liver, it can lead to autoimmune hepatitis, et cetera, et cetera. It can gravitate toward any tissue. That inflammation can show up in any tissue and show up as multiple different kinds of disease. And that's why the average person with one autoimmune disease over their lifetime will develop 7 different kinds of autoimmunity. And that's important to understand that, because people with autoimmune disease on average die about 26 years earlier than people without autoimmune disease. So if you've got autoimmunity and you're not addressing it at its core and at its origin, then the likelihood that you're going to have a much shorter lifespan is extremely high. So again, gluten sensitivity is a state of genetics. You either have these genes, okay, these gene markers for gluten sensitivity, or you don't have them. And if you have them and you're eating gluten, then you will produce inflammation as a byproduct. So now let's go back and answer that question that was asked. Are there good glutens? Are there bad glutens? There are bad. All glutens are going to be bad if you have a gene pattern that your body says, hey, we don't like gluten. If you have that gene pattern, there's no such thing as a good gluten. They're all bad glutens. If you don't have that gene pattern, then gluten shouldn't be an issue for you. There are other things in grain that might be an issue for you, but gluten will not be that issue. So that's the answer to that question. Hopefully that was helpful for you. Now, on that note, you know, we've gotten with our lab, and our lab has agreed to offer up a number of discounted DNA tests. So if anybody wants to go and grab those, they're usually a little bit more expensive, but we've got a coupon code for you to use tonight, and that coupon code is to save $50 on that test. So if any of you are not sure whether or not going gluten-free is the right thing for you to do, or you'd like to get better confirmation, we have, again, a discount coupon code you can use to have these gene patterns measured. And at that point, you'll know for certain whether or not that's the right move for you. So that hopefully answers that question. I'm going to go ahead and answer a few more questions here. Sherry's asking, Sherry, I'm not sure I understand your question fully. The question says, can it lead to Crohn's? And if you mean can gluten lead to Crohn's, then the answer is absolutely yes, it can, and especially corn gluten. As a matter of fact, there are a number of studies showing how corn gluten is actually a major trigger for Crohn's disease, both Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. So Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis are 2 types of inflammatory bowel disease that affect the large intestine, whereas celiac disease is the type of inflammatory bowel disease that affects the small intestine. But and gluten can contribute to or cause all 3. I've actually seen all 3 be clinically relevant. So hopefully that's helpful for you. Sheila's asking if 23andMe tests the alpha gene patterns. No, 23andMe doesn't even test it to accuracy. They don't test the alpha 1 and beta 1 pattern. They test something called a SNP, and that's a different entity altogether. What they're looking for are these 2 patterns. There's 2 patterns called HLA-DQ2 and HLA-DQ8 patterns. These are patterns of genes on the HLA-DQ gene that are linked to celiac disease. That's why if you look at the 23andMe panel, it says celiac disease, celiac disease genes. It's because these 2 are linked to celiac disease. But understand there are additional HLA-DQ patterns beyond these 2 patterns that are gluten-sensitive patterns. And so 23andMe doesn't give you that information. So let's go through an example. Let's say that you run that test and it tells you that you're not DQ2 or DQ8. It doesn't mean you're not gluten sensitive, because if you have a DQ1 or a DQ3 pattern, those are also gluten sensitive patterns. And again, that test will not detect that. It will not pick it up. The reason why 23andMe does what's called SNP testing, which is very inexpensive. You can run on these SNP platforms, you can run hundreds of different genes and get tests for different SNPs for very low cost. But when you actually run a test, it's measuring the gene type pattern. It's much more expensive. It's much more costly. There's a lot more labor involved in running that type of genetic test, which is why it's a little bit more expensive to actually isolate your gene allele patterns than it is to just determine whether or not you have a genetic SNP. So to answer your question, I know I kind of went in depth there, but no, 23andMe is not an accurate way to analyze whether or not you are gluten sensitive. Okay, somebody's asking about sprouted grains, and not sure about that question, but I'll answer kind of an issue with sprouted grains. So sprouted grains are a no-no. If you're gluten sensitive, sprouted grains are definitely out. If you're not gluten sensitive, maybe not so much, but you still have to, again, you have to consider what's in grain. Let's have a conversation. I think that question merits a question or a conversation about seeds, because a lot of you are also chiming in about flaxseed and other kinds of seeds. Seeds are, in a nutshell, seeds are designed by Mother Nature to protect and preserve their own species. And so all seeds, to an extent, have mechanisms of chemical warfare protection. Let's think about this from a perspective of fruit seeds. Apple seeds have cyanide poisoning in them. Cherry pits have the same thing. Peach pits do too. And one of the reasons why Mother Nature gives these seeds protective poisons is because, again, the seeds, they want to be able to defend themselves from predators, but they're not animate. They can't get up and walk away or run away from predators. They have to be able to protect themselves. And so one of the ways they do that is by harboring toxic chemicals. And remember, what is grain? Grain is the seed of grass. Now, if we were just talking about grass all by itself, 40%, estimated 40% of the US population has a grass allergy. But yet our staple diet, our staple food in our diet is the seed of that thing that 40% of us are allergic to. And not to mention beyond that, that again, the seeds themselves have other protective mechanisms that can do harm to humans, especially in mass quantities. So if you look at gluten, gluten is just one example of a family of protein found within grains that can harm and do damage. There are other families of proteins within grain. One of them is called an ATI, an amylase trypsin inhibitor. And this type of protein actually shuts down human digestion. It's a protein that blocks the pancreas from secreting digestive enzymes. And that can be a big problem. That can be a big problem for a lot of people. So understand, when I say it's more than gluten deep, that's why I wrote No Grain, No Pain. I wrote that book because there's so many elements about grain that can be toxic. And it's so much deeper than just looking at gluten. There are a lot of people who aren't gluten sensitive. They think they're gluten sensitive because they cut grain out of their diet and felt better. But the reality was maybe they weren't gluten sensitive. Maybe they were actually sensitive to ATIs. Maybe those ATIs were shutting down their digestion. Maybe it was the pesticide in the grain. Maybe it was the molds and mold mycotoxins that grains tend to harbor a lot of. Maybe it was the heavy metal that grain tends to harbor a lot of. So again, it's guesswork. So if you're going on a gluten-free diet and you're doing like a diet by trial to see whether or not it's the right diet for you to follow, I don't discourage that. I just want to iterate that just because you feel better when you cut grain out of your diet doesn't mean you're gluten sensitive. It could be the other qualities of grains. It could be the other properties or the other chemicals that grains are processed with that you're getting a reprieve from or that you're getting relief from. So keep that in mind, which is one of the reasons why I highly encourage people to get tested, because remember, this is a diet change that if it's the right diet, first of all, it's very, very, it's challenging, especially initially. It can be challenging because it's so far different from what most people grew up with. So for me as a doctor to demand that my patient goes on a diet without scientific objective justification is foolhardy, because as most people have experienced, you know, we all go through times in our life where we say, we're going to do this challenge or that challenge. We're going to do 2 weeks of avoiding sugar. We're going to do this detox, right? We want to justify changing your diet for the rest of your life, not for a few weeks so you can feel better and then go back to feeling bad. And that's why testing, that's why it becomes a critical element. If you really want to justify knowing whether or not you're going to need to go gluten-free for the rest of your life, testing is really the only thing I would recommend, because if you don't test and you don't know, the odds that you're going to start cheating and slipping back in the other direction are extremely high. Is there any way to get insurance to cover the test? My advice would be to, if you go through a doctor, you might be able to grab the CPT codes from the doctor and submit your claim. But beyond that, probably not. And even if you go through a doctor, it's not guaranteed that you'll get it covered. At least that's our experience in our clinic. Okay, let's go to some other questions here. What about brown rice? That's clean. No, brown rice contains gluten. So it's you know, brown rice isn't clean either. Brown rice contains arsenic and cadmium. We have this this kind of misrepresentation that brown rice is somehow healthier than white rice. White rice is white because it's polished, so they wash off the outer coating of the rice and leave the inside to eat. And that actually, white rice is the reason why many nutritional deficiency diseases developed at the turn of the century, early 1900s. Brown rice isn't much better in terms of gluten or in terms of heavy metal content. And if it's not organically grown, is no better, especially in terms of pesticide content. So no, brown rice is no better than white rice in that regard. Okay, Rogby's asking about wild rice. Wild rice is not a grain. It's not egg rice. Wild rice is actually a grass. It's a form of marsh grass. So generally, it's grown in Canada. It's grown in the upper north in the Americas. Minnesota, they do a lot of wild rice growing there. It's technically not a grain at all. It's a marsh grass. So from a gluten perspective, it is gluten-free and it is safe. But some people don't tolerate it well because it's hard to digest. You have to cook it a really long time. But again, it's from a gluten perspective, it's safe. Okay. Looks like we're getting some questions about soy and Parkinson's disease. Is soy linked to autoimmune disease? Mostly it's genetically modified soy that we find is a trigger for autoimmunity. Soy is one of those foods, soy and corn. So originally, again, celiac disease originally was discovered that wheat, barley, and rye can cause the damage to the intestine that is the hallmark symptom of celiac disease. But studies have also revealed that soy can cause villus atrophy as well as corn. Corn can also cause villus atrophy. So to answer your question, soy, especially GMO soy, is one of those that's known to trigger leaky gut. It's known to cause villus atrophy. Therefore, it's known to trigger autoimmunity. So there can be a link. I've had patients with Parkinson's do really, really well going grain-free and even improve upon going grain-free as a result of omitting soy. Soy is not a food I recommend. One of the reasons why is the genetic manipulation, but one of the other reasons why is that for men especially, soy is very, very high in estrogen-based chemicals. And actually, you know, we always hear about how the monks in the monasteries use soy and it's such a healthy, wonderful food. And in reality, in China, the reason that soy was used as a heavy food is because of its estrogenic properties. It would actually suppress sexual urges in monks, and that was one of the main reasons it was used in monasteries, because it was all men, and so it was used almost as a sexual depressant. So I don't recommend soy for men, especially soy milks and soy bars and soy processed foods. I don't recommend them, primarily because they're highly processed and not good for you. But again, a lot of them are processed and genetically modified and have been grown with a number of different pesticides that aren't good for you either. So not a food I recommend if you're trying to overcome autoimmune disease. Okay. So Veronica's chiming in and saying, for the last 6 days, I've been eating phase 1 of no grain, no pain, and doing a 16-hour fast with an 8-hour eating window. In the morning at 12 hours into the fast, my blood sugars are running 100 to 112. Should I be concerned? No, absolutely not. I'd say when you're fasting, Veronica, where you get concerned is if your blood sugars are crashing and you can't sustain brain function and you can't get out of bed. That's where some people are not, they don't do well with fasting, especially diabetics who are taking insulin. The fasting section of the no grain, no pain protocol, you know, with diabetics, we say proceed with caution. It doesn't mean the diabetic can't fast. It just means you've got to monitor your blood sugar a lot more aggressively. But blood sugar dropping to 100, 112 is not a problem at all. I would say judge it by how you feel and how cognizant and how much brain power, brain function that you have. Sheila's asking, if you have been off of gluten and you test, would it still show a gluten sensitivity? It depends on how you test. if you're doing blood tests for antibodies and you've been off gluten, you'll probably come back false negative. If you're doing genetic testing, however, you cannot trick genetic testing, which is another reason why it's a better way to test. Your genes are what your genes are, and that will never change. And so genetic testing, you cannot trick. You either have gluten sensitive genes or you don't, and that won't change based on whether you're eating gluten today, tomorrow, or next week, unlike the blood test. The blood test can be very, very tricky to navigate. Okay. Jan's chiming in. My mom was diagnosed celiac 15 years ago at age 70. I have had health issues all my life. I had a scope after her diagnosis and it came out negative. So I had a stool test at Interolab that came out positive. Gluten-free 15 years and grain-free for 1 year. Do you advise the gene test for me? Depends on how you were tested at Interolab. Interolab they don't test for the full gene. They test for half. And you may not even have had the gene test done with Interolab. You may have had just a stool test where they were measuring anti-gliadin antibodies in your stool, which is what a lot of people do with Interolab. I'd say where you'd have a greater concern if you just had an anti-gliadin test. Remember that gliadin, as we drew on the board earlier, gliadin is only found in wheat, barley, and rye. So all you really know at this point is that you have a problem with wheat, barley, and rye if the test you had done was an anti-gliadin antibody. So, my advice is, yeah, get genetically tested if that was what happened. But if you were positive genetically, then don't worry about moving forward and getting tested again. I'd also say if you're feeling better with grain-free, then go ahead and continue on that endeavor. It's certainly not going to hurt you to avoid grain. Beth Ann is asking about popcorn with 3 question marks. Popcorn's a grain. Corn has, by volume, more gluten than any other grain except wheat. 55% of the protein content of corn is actually a form of corn gluten. Corn gluten, in 2012, a study came out showing that corn gluten interacts with this antenna that I was talking about earlier, with that HLA-DQ receptor, interacts with that DQ receptor and creates inflammation more aggressively than wheat gluten. So to answer your question, Beth Ann, about popcorn, don't recommend it. Okay. Let's see here. How different are herbs? I've heard that herbs are protective against the fruits and vegetables it grows around and therefore toxic and should not be consumed. What are your thoughts? I'm not quite sure I understand that question. Maybe type it in again and reword it. If you're asking me whether or not herbs that grow near wheat are a problem, I'd say the biggest problem might be cross-contamination as they're being picked, but I'm not sure. Again, I'm not sure if I understood that question. Okay, so what milk do you suggest if you're trying to eat a vegetarian diet? So I want to be clear, Tanya, is that a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet? Is that a vegetarian diet that allows, obviously it allows milk, but does it also allow fish? So, I mean, there are varieties of vegetarian diet. I just want to make sure that we're talking about the same definition. If you'll clarify that, I'll answer that question a little bit more aggressively. But on that note, let's talk about milk. I think milk is another topic that a lot of people aren't aware of, the dangers of dairy as it relates to gluten and other grain. One of the things we know in human studies is that when a mother is breastfeeding and she's eating grain, that the gluten shows up in her breast milk. Now, that's not by any means a message saying that women shouldn't breastfeed. I'm a big advocate of breastfeeding, but if a person is gluten sensitive, if the baby's gluten sensitive, mom's going to have to forego grain if baby's going to be healthy. Nobody's really truly studied the dairy and mammals like cows or goat and analyzed and looked for gluten in the milk. So we can't with great definitive yes say that dairy is a problem as it relates to gluten. We can only use common sense and good judgment and say, well, if it passes through humans, there's a potential possibility it could pass through the dairy of animals that are eating grain as well. Now, but the bigger problem in cow milk especially is the genetic manipulation of our cows. There's a protein in the dairy of these GMO cows called casein. It's actually, this protein is in all dairy, but casein is in genetically manipulated cows, the casein mimics gluten. So the casein basically looks a lot like that alpha gliadin. And so a lot of people react to dairy just like they react to gluten for that reason. Now, one of the other problems with dairy, this is a study of actually several studies that have been done that were done out of South America. And what they're doing is they're analyzing processed dairy because there's an enzyme that gets added to dairy called MTG. MTG stands for microbial transglutaminase, and what it does is it thickens yogurt, it thickens milk, it thickens dairy, but it also extends the shelf life. So you get a preservation of shelf life with these foods, or when you add this enzyme to dairy. But the problem that they're finding is that when you treat dairy with this enzyme, it makes the dairy resemble and look like that gliadin or that gluten. So again, you know, whether you're eating the processed dairy that has MTG in it, or whether you're buying just your regular brand of milk at the grocery store, a lot of people are going to tend to react to those things. Now, some people will say, well, what about raw milk from non-genetically modified cows? How is that? That can be okay, but in the no grain, no pain diet program with phase 1 and phase 2, we're talking about autoimmune disease. And so one of the triggers, one of the most common food triggers in autoimmune disease is dairy, and it has nothing to do with gluten. It has to do with the dairy itself. Humans by default lose their ability to process dairy around the age of 3, and that's a different problem altogether. That has nothing to do with gluten. That's what we call intolerance. And if you've ever heard of lactose intolerance, that's what that's referring to. Lactose is not a protein like gluten, like casein. Lactose is actually a sugar. It's a carbohydrate, and many people can't process lactose. They don't have the digestive enzyme capacity to break it down, and so it creates gas and bloating. It creates putrefaction in the gut, which can lead to irritable bowel syndrome, cause leaky gut, and create a whole slew of problems afterwards. So what happens is a lot of people have lactose intolerance because they've been eating gluten, and the gluten has damaged their intestines to such a great degree. And remember that the intestines produce an enzyme that breaks down lactose. That enzyme is called lactase, and your brush border in your intestine actually makes that enzyme. So if you've got this history of gluten consumption and you've basically damaged your intestines for years and years and years, you might be lactose intolerant, not because you're truly lactose intolerant, but because you've damaged your intestines to such a great degree that you no longer have the capacity to digest the dairy. And so secondarily to that, it leads to a slew of problems afterward. So that's one of the other issues that a lot of people are going to have with dairy. And probably of all the foods in my clinic, and I've been doing and treating and visiting with patients with autoimmune disease for 15 years now. And if I would say that the 3 most common food triggers for autoimmunity that I see, grain by far is number 1, dairy is number 2, and sugar is number 3. So if you can look at those 3 food groups, if you're just trying to clean up your diet and try to eradicate autoimmune disease, those are 3 food groups. It's not a bad place to start. Okay. So Vic is asking if I have any special recommendations about Sjogren's. Sjogren's is a form of autoimmunity that affects the tear ducts. It also affects the salivary ducts in the mouth and the submandibular sublingual glands, which secrete saliva. And so it tends to cause a lot of dry eye, a lot of dry mouth, because there's an autoimmune disease against those glands. No, there's no special recommendation for Sjogren's beyond going back to what I said in the beginning of the conversation tonight. Sjogren's is an autoimmune condition. So with it, you have to analyze and you have to look at those 4 fundamental reasons why autoimmune disease develops in the first place. I've seen a number of cases of Sjogren's go into complete remission. It's not really hard to get it to go into remission. You just have to make sure that you're looking at those 4 fundamental reasons why it could occur in the first place. Okay. So getting a question, is coconut milk okay? Coconut water, coconut oil? Sure. What you have to be careful with any of these is how they're processed, and if there are other added ingredients that could potentially be a problem for you. One of the most common added ingredients to milks that are non-dairy milks, like coconut milk, cashew milk, almond milk, etc., is a compound. It's a seaweed-based compound called carrageenan. And this particular compound for a lot of people can cause a lot of gastrointestinal inflammation. So again, if your gut's already compromised and you're using a lot of these non-dairy milks with carrageenan, it can pose a problem. But you can also find these non-dairy milks that don't contain that particular substance. So again, it's just a matter of reading that food label and making sure that you're choosing one that doesn't contain that. Okay. So now I want to go ahead and throw up another poll here. I want to kind of get a feel for what you guys are experiencing. And so we're going to throw that up. What kind of pain, what kind of symptoms, what kind of problems are you dealing with? Because I'd like to just dive into some of the specificity so that I can give you better help coming out of this webinar. And also, while we are waiting here, there's been a lot of questions about digestion. I'm not going to be able to probably get to 100% of them, but one of the questions that keeps coming back over and over again is that, do people with gluten sensitivity need to be on a digestive enzyme? And in my experience, the answer to that question is yes. It's a very, very smart idea. But you have to be careful about the digestive enzyme that you're buying. A lot of enzymes are grown and they're produced on a corn-based culture. So a lot of people will react to digestive enzymes. They'll think that digestive enzymes are damaging them not because necessarily they're bad for them, but because of the way that they're processed. There are a number of formulas that claim to block gluten or claim to do things with gluten that actually contain rice in them. And those are, I definitely don't recommend those particular types. I'm going to pop one up on the screen that I recommend. It's a formula that I've created based on my experience in the clinic. It's actually designed for two things. It's designed for people who are, number one, gluten sensitive and trying to protect themselves from cross-contamination. So if they're eating out at a restaurant or traveling and eating, this particular enzyme can break down gluten very, very rapidly. This enzyme is not designed and it's not intended for you to go eat pizza. So don't take it under the auspice that you take a bunch of this so that you can go have your cheat meal. It's not designed for that, and no digestive enzyme that degrades gluten is. That's not the reason that it's to be used. It's to be used to protect you from cross-contamination. So it's very important that you understand that. Now, that's one of the reasons why you use it. One of the other reasons why you use it is that if you've got a lot of gastrointestinal distress, if you've been eating gluten a long time and you're just getting started on this diet, you know, one of the issues is that your gut has not fully recovered. Remember, your gut, if your gut's damaged, a lot of the enzymes that you make to digest your food are made by your gut. And if they're made by your pancreas and they're made by your gut. And so if your gut is compromised, you won't have the digestive capacity to break your food down very effectively. So sometimes being on a digestive enzyme for the first 6 to 12 months going grain-free is a really good idea, and it can be very, very helpful and get you through that first aspect so that you can start digesting your food better and getting nourishment from your food better. But this particular formula that I'm throwing up is called Ultra Digest. It was actually designed because so many people with gluten issues also have gallbladder issues, and they've either had a gallbladder issue where they don't process bile very well and they can't digest fat very well, or they've had their gallbladder removed. And so one of the things that I wanted to try to accomplish with it was to give support for digestion, not just in people with gluten sensitivity who don't have enough enzymes, but to also give support for people who don't have a gallbladder and need extra help but being able to break down fat and absorb fat, because fat is very, very crucial. Remember, what is fat? It's vitamin A and vitamin D and vitamin E and vitamin K and omega-3 fatty acids. Those are all fat. So if you don't have the capacity to break fat down, you start becoming malnourished in fat-soluble vitamins and nutrients. And that in and of itself, one of the most notorious reasons that autoimmune disease exists is vitamin D deficiency. And so if you're not able to process vitamin D from your diet because you don't have the digestive enzymes to be able to wrap around that fat and absorb it, then it can pose a long-term problem in your recovery process from autoimmunity. So something I highly recommend is a digestive enzyme if you're not already on one. And I think we might even have a promotional code for that to save you some money. So yeah, I think it's no pain. So if you use that, you'll save a bunch of money, and you'll get it. You can try it, and if it works well for you, well, hopefully it'll work well for you, and you can continue to use it as you need it. Okay, let's see here. Another great question, and I'm going to get to the poll again. I'm going to get to the poll results in just a minute. Danielle is chiming in. Do you recommend probiotics? So this is the other. Sally, would you post a link for everybody on probiotics? Probably many of you may have seen the research that came out recently on probiotics being contaminated with gluten. It's a huge problem, and just like digestive enzymes, a lot of probiotics are actually grown on grain cultures. So they can be a very, very big problem for people in that regard, especially those of you with gluten sensitivity. So choosing the right brand of probiotic becomes ultra critical. And then it's actually one of the reasons why I had to formulate my own probiotic, was because of that problem. It was just very hard to find a professional grade probiotic that was strong enough in its dose to be effective, to be able to help people with gluten sensitivity. I absolutely recommend probiotics for the first year going on a gluten-free diet, unless you're under the auspice of a treating doctor, unless you have a doctor that's monitoring your microbiome and measuring your microbiome, and you're just going it alone. I recommend that you're on probiotics for at least 12 months beyond going gluten-free. Now, there was a recent research study that came out on probiotics and antibiotics, and what was found is that one dose of antibiotics can disrupt the bacteria microbiome for up to a year. So those of you who've been on an antibiotic recently, again, think about that. That antibiotic will disrupt your flora for up to a year. This is why it's a very good idea to take probiotics, because even if you're not taking an antibiotic, if you're eating meat that's not grass-fed, pasture-raised, and not organic, the vast majority of antibiotic exposure that humans get come from the meat that we eat in our diet, unless we're eating high-quality meat. We also can get antibiotics from our drinking water. I live in Houston, and in the general Houston vicinity, we have 42 prescription medications that have been isolated and identified in our water. So if you live in a major metropolitan area, you can bet that's probably very similar for you in that regard. And antibiotics are one of those medications commonly showing up in the drinking water. So even if you're not taking antibiotics, you're probably getting exposure. And so that's why one of the reasons why a probiotic is a very, very strong recommendation that I have. Now, again, not all probiotics are created equally. And not all species are the same, and not all formulations are the same. And many of the formulations contain gluten or are grown on gluten-based culture. So you have to be really, really careful about the probiotic form that you're using. And that's why, again, I have a couple of different varieties. I have one that's called Biotic Defense, and then I have another one called Ultrabiotic Defense. And so those of you who might be suffering with severe inflammatory bowel disease like celiac, Crohn's, or ulcerative colitis, Ultrabiotic Defense is going to work much, much better than the regular strength version, because the dose is so much higher. When you have high inflammation in your GI tract, taking too low a dose of a probiotic is a lot like trying to spit out a forest fire. It's very hard to spit out a forest fire. It's impossible to spit out a forest fire. So you have to get the right dose of probiotic in you if you're going to have any kind of meaningful impact on your gut flora when you also have concomitant inflammatory bowel disease. Okay. Let's see here. I wanted to get back to that poll. So, what types of pain are we looking at in the audience tonight? Looks like joint arthritis is the number one problem that everyone's complaining of. So it goes in this order: joint arthritis, 25% of you, 18% of you claim muscle pain. And then 16% of you have gastrointestinal pain, 14% have chronic fatigue and brain fog. So let's, and then looks like 6% or so have neuropathy. So a lot of pain in the room. Let's talk a little bit about that, because this is another one of the things I get. Actually, today, as part of the No Grain No Pain book launch, we did about 20 radio interviews today, and one of the biggest questions I kept getting asked over and over again actually had to do with how in the world could what you eat cause joint or muscle pain. A lot of the radio stations that were interviewing me were just completely baffled by the concept that what you eat could actually cause pain in your joint. Most people understand that what you eat can cause a problem in your gut, but they don't understand the process of how what you eat actually will contribute to a problem in your joints. So I'm going to draw you a picture here. And this is a cross-sectional representation of the intestine. And I'm drawing it two-dimensionally, one, because I'm a horrible artist, but two, because it's easier to understand it. And so imagine what we're looking at here is actually a tube. It's the tube. It's the lumen or the tube of the gut. So, you know, again, this is a tube, and the cells that line the tube are these columnar-shaped blocks that I've drawn in. So these are the cells, and then these little dash marks here are called tight junctions. These are little proteins that snap the cells in the GI tract together, because if those cells are not snapped together, what you end up with are gaps where these cells split apart, and that's what we call leaky gut. When these cells split apart, when there's an opening, and this can happen two ways. The leak can occur between the cells, or you can get things that can damage the cell itself and split the cell and leak through. So there's kind of a couple different mechanisms of how leaky gut can occur. But these tight junctions are proteins that work kind of like Lego blocks. They snap the cells together and they hold them together and keep them strong as a barrier. Remember that the GI tract has 5 primary barriers that protect us from developing a leaky gut problem. And I know I'm talking about the intestine, and I promise you I'm going to make this make sense as it relates to your joints. The second layer, or the second barrier in the GI tract, is mucus. You actually produce a layer of mucus in the GI tract, and that mucus is a physical coating. It's a physical coating that covers the cells, so it puts a barrier in between the food and the chemicals that you're eating and the things that you're eating, so it kind of protects the surface of these cells and prevents them from getting damaged. Then we have, on the surface of the mucus and embedded in the mucus, we have another layer, number 3, and that's your microbiome. This is your good bacteria. This is kind of what I was talking about earlier with probiotics. These are your probiotics. And you are outnumbered 10-to-1 by bacteria. You have 10 times more bacteria in and on your body than you have human cells. And these bacteria, as a matter of fact, they're getting ready to classify the microbiome as a human organ. That's how important it is. So when we take an antibiotic, we're actually wiping out a human organ and all its functions. The microbiome is responsible for helping you digest your food, metabolize certain nutrients from your food, producing B vitamins. The microbiome also is very critical and very important because it actually does something called crosstalk. In your gut wall, you have a set of proverbial tonsils, and these tonsils, also referred to as the GALT, the gastro-associated lymphoid tissue, represents 70% to 75% of your entire immune system is wrapping around your small intestine. And it's there to protect you, because if something leaks through, your immune system is right there to stop it. And your microbiome talks to your GALT. It warns your GALT. It says, hey, something's breaking through, get ready. So there's a communication that occurs between your immune system and those bacteria. And that's just another reason why the microbiome is such an important barrier. But that GALT, we'll call that barrier number 4. Okay, and I told you before, I said that there are 5 primary barriers. The other barrier is a little bit further up north. We're going to draw it in, and it's your stomach acid. And your stomach acid is responsible for a number of different important functions. One of those functions has to do with secreting acid, and that acid actually kills bacteria, it kills parasites, it kills yeast, things that might not necessarily belong further down in your GI tract. That stomach acid is responsible as one of those barriers to help prevent infection. But that stomach acid is also critical for your immune system function. Remember, most of what your immune system works off of is protein. And we have to get protein by eating it. And if we suppress stomach acid, or we don't have enough stomach acid, then we don't absorb protein very efficiently. You need acid to be able to break protein down into smaller amino acids so that you can absorb it into your bloodstream. So suppressing stomach acid with antacid medications causes protein malnourishment, but you also need stomach acid to absorb vitamin B12 and calcium and zinc and iron and magnesium and selenium and vitamin A and vitamin B2. So there's just a number of different nutrients that you can't absorb properly without adequate stomach acid. So beyond the nutrient deficiencies and those issues that can crop up if you don't have enough stomach acid, remember, stomach acid is there to help defend you from infection. So I'm going to get back to arthritis, I promise you. So these 5 barriers, right? We ask the next question, okay, if these 5 barriers keep us from developing a leaky gut, then how are these barriers broken down? In other words, what can we do to prevent a breakdown in these barriers? Well, one is don't take antacid medications. Don't take Tums and Rolaids. Don't say, oh, I better take my Mylanta because I want to go and eat greasy Mexican food tonight. And then you just justify a poor diet by coating your stomach with a substance that causes the suppression of stomach acid. Avoid those types of drugs. The microbiome, again, that's antibiotics. So antibiotics is going to be one of the major contributors to breaking this barrier down. This mucus barrier, barrier number 2, is eroded by pain medications. Anytime you've taken ibuprofen or aspirin or Celebrex or Mobic or naproxen, these are all what are called non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. They erode the mucus lining. That's why if you ever read the bottle, it says this product can cause intestinal and gastric bleeding because it erodes the mucus. It's one of the side effects. And we have these tight junctions. There are about 11 different things that can blow up your tight junctions. Gluten is probably the most well studied. Plastics and pesticides are known to do it. Certain other kinds of medications. There are a few different kinds of blood pressure medications. They can disrupt your tight junctions as well. So again, you've got a number of different things in your environment that you can avoid, okay, that will help keep your barriers intact. And okay, so now let's break this down. Let's talk about how it relates to arthritis. Once this leaky gut develops, you get bacteria. Sometimes they're not the right kind of bacteria. Sometimes they're infectious bacteria. They're the things that leak in. Bacteria, bacterial byproducts like lipopolysaccharides or LPSs. I know it sounds a little bit like the Princess Bride, rodents of unusual ROUSs, right? LPSs, but anyway, I divert. The bacterial byproducts can break through. Those things can get into your bloodstream. They can travel to your joints. They can set up shop in your joints, and they can create an inflammatory response because when they get there, they start attracting immune cells. Those immune cells will then travel into the joints, and they'll start creating a war, and there'll be a battlefield in the cartilage. And that battlefield will lead to degradation in the cartilage. It'll lead to an immune response in the cartilage. It'll slowly deteriorate and break that joint apart, creating physical pain. So that's one of the mechanisms of how, these barriers are important, because if things start leaking through, they can now get access to your muscles, to your joints, and to your other internal organs and tissues. And this is how it manifests. This is how, for many people, this is the people that don't develop celiac disease per se, this is how the autoimmune disease manifests. It's through the process of breaking down those barriers and getting access to the bloodstream, where it can then travel about and really have access to any of the tissues in your body. So those of you with chronic muscle pain and joint arthritis who prior to tonight didn't think that what you ate had anything to do with how your joints felt, or maybe you had a doctor tell you you're just getting older and you're just going to have to accept this, nothing could be further from the truth. As a matter of fact, I've seen more chronic joint pain go away, and probably the biggest culprit, at least in my clinical experience, that I've seen is corn. Corn gluten is probably one of the worst as it relates to chronic pain and inflammation in the joints and in the muscles. So if you're having chronic pains, aches and pains, really, really dial that diet in. Let's get you on the no grain, no pain protocol. Take it for a spin drive, take it for a test drive, do it for 30 days. And you'll see my meaning, because you'll help seal your gut, and the pains and the aches will start to go away, and you'll realize that it's not old age that you were experiencing. It was just, it was a pathological process, or a disease-causing process that was being induced by food ripping a hole in your gut and getting access to your bloodstream and subsequently your muscles and joints. So again, that's how. Now, some of the other questions I'm getting asked are, what types of supplements help? One of the big things is that a lot of people say, well, how do I exercise? How can I exercise? My joints hurt all the time. How can I reduce this inflammation without taking a drug? Because as I said before, one of the concepts I talk about in the book is called the prescription pain trap. And it has to do with when you take a number of these different medications that erode the lining of your gut and create leaky gut, you're actually just prolonging the potential for that disease and for that disease process. But the other thing is that many of these drugs that people take to alleviate these types of symptoms create vitamin and mineral deficiencies that prevent your joints and your muscles from repairing themselves. And so you end up in this state of, I need the drug to reduce the pain, but to reduce the pain, I'm causing leaky gut and I'm causing vitamin and mineral deficiencies. And the leaky gut and the vitamin and mineral deficiencies make sure that the pain never goes away. So I'm stuck in this vicious cycle and this vicious trap. How can you break free of that cycle? Well, this is where supplementation can be very, very helpful. And one of the supplements that I recommend is turmeric. And you have to be very, very careful with turmeric if you're going to use it to help modulate pain, because a lot of people will take it and it doesn't work very well for them. And one of the reasons why is they're not getting anywhere near enough of the dose. So the dose, first of all, has to be very meaningful. But the other thing that has to be meaningful is the active ingredient in the turmeric. So there are a number of different chemical plant compounds in turmeric, but the one that actually has been shown to do the most pain relief and to deliver the most anti-inflammatory response is something called a curcuminoid. So if you're using a turmeric, you really want something that's concentrated to contain at least 90% of active curcuminoids. And if it doesn't contain that, then what you're probably getting is a dose. Again, using the analogy, you're spitting on a forest fire, you're not going to put out the inflammation. So you need a good 1 to 3 grams of turmeric and a concentrated 90 to 95% curcuminoid dose to be able to make an impact on severe chronic inflammatory pain. So that's one of the supplements that I highly recommend. I think we also have, I have a formulation of that as well, a bioavailable formation or formulation of that, and we'll put that up for you if you want to try that, and we've got a discount coupon for you to use if you want to check that out as well. There are a couple of other supplements that in my clinic that I see being extremely effective. One of them is omega-3 fatty acids. Now, going back to what I said earlier about digestive enzymes, many of you won't be able to absorb fats very well because you don't have a gallbladder or you've got a damaged GI tract. And so you're leaking fat. You're not absorbing the fat properly. In fact, omega-3 is a fat. So one of the best forms of omega-3, and one of the reasons I formulate it with a compound called lipase, because lipase is a digestive enzyme that kind of pre-digests that fat for you so that it gets right in and you can absorb it. So it's very important for those of you, especially that have those types of issues. If you're going to get a meaningful dose of fish oil to help reduce inflammation, you've got to take it in a manner that's going to allow you to absorb it and get that active ingredient into your bloodstream. And so that's where I use I have a formulation called Omega, Ultra Omega, that works extremely well, and it has a digestive enzyme in it to help you be able to break it down and process it. And 2 to 4 grams is a good place to start with that particular type of fish oil, but you can go upwards of 6 to 8 grams. You have to be careful because it does thin your blood. So if you're on a blood thinner, you've got to be careful not to thin your blood too much. And if you're going in to have a surgical procedure, you don't want to take fish oil generally about a week before the procedure. You can take it after the procedure, but when you're going into surgery, you don't want to be bleeding so thinly that when they cut you, that they have a hard time patching you back up because your blood's too thin. So just a couple of precautions about using fish oil there. Okay, let's get back. Actually, I wanted to pop up on some of the notes that we're talking about. I wanted to talk, because we're just talking about arthritis, so I want to share with you a story of arthritis recovery. This particular patient of mine had severe arthritis, had severe neurological damage, had a drop foot from the neurological damage. And so I want to share her story with you, because I think sharing stories and sharing positive outcomes kind of empowers you to take that next step and helps you. So let's take a pause for just a minute and let's listen to Susan's story. Okay, we're back. Yeah, just a super powerful story. Another, again, somebody um, who was non-functional, and again, simple diet change, people. It's that powerful, but it has to be done in a manner that's consistent. It has to be done with intelligence. Diet change has to be justified, and so many of you probably struggling with problems are wondering, okay, how can I determine those four things? So one of the questions that's coming in is what kind of lab testing do we get done to help determine those four fundamental things, to identify food allergies, to identify chemicals, to identify whether or not we have heavy metal toxicity, or whether or not we have vitamin and mineral deficiencies. There are a number of different lab tests that do this. I use some very customized. Actually, I have some labs that I contact and I tell them how I want them to do things, and that's the way they go about doing it. So it just depends. But my advice to you, on as far as lab tests are concerned, is really get with a solid, reputable functional medicine doctor. And if you get those four parts figured out, you'll get your diet tweaked and customized to a level that is going to help you be so successful in recovery, far more successful than going at it on your own and doing a lot of guessing. Now, that doesn't mean you can't get an education, in that you shouldn't be doing guessing. You should be listening to your body, and you should be getting an education, and you should be making your own attempts. But if you're struggling and you're in a hard place, it's really a great idea to work with somebody who can give you those solid answers back. Okay, I want to get to some more questions here. Somebody was asking about krill oil versus fish oil. Hands down for pain, hands down, omega-3 from fish oil is far more effective in my experience clinically than krill oil. The other problem with krill oil is that it's derived from krill, and a lot of people have shellfish reactions or have shellfish problems. So we get a lot of patients that don't tolerate krill oil at all, beyond the fact that it smells like a penguin exhibit, and it can be very hard to swallow and very hard to take. It's just not as effective at anti-inflammatory elimination for chronic pain. Okay. Another question. Let's see here. Do antidepressants, from Joanne, do antidepressants help or heed healing of leaky gut? They actually hinder it. And one of the reasons why, and it can depend on the class of antidepressant, but most antidepressants fall within this category called SSRIs. So we're running out of room here. SSRIs, the Paxil, Prozac, and some of the other main forms. SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are drugs that affect serotonin. And realize that the vast majority of serotonin is not made in your brain. It's made in your gut. And that's why using antidepressants can cause irritable bowel syndrome. They can affect and hinder gut motility. And so one of the side effects can be a kind of an intermittent diarrhea and constipation, or an IBS kind of phasic type of response or side effect. And what happens when we're in that constipation phase if we have leaky gut? And we have a bowel that's not moving, and we have waste product in the gut it's not moving through, and it's just sitting there. And then the longer it sits there, the more it has the opportunity to come in and do harm and to wreak havoc. So we want normal flowing bowels, and if we're taking medications that affect our bowel function, affect our bowel movement, that can be a really, really big problem. Now, the other reasons antidepressants can affect the healing of leaky gut has to do with vitamin B12 deficiency. They're known to reduce your vitamin B12 levels. And the problem with that is vitamin B12 is one of the main vitamins that help these cells right here, these cells in your intestine, turn over. Now, these cells in your intestine have a lifespan of 2 to 7 days, meaning that they live and die and replicate new cells every 2 to 7 days. Vitamin B12 deficiency will not allow for that replication, because one of vitamin B12's functions is in the replication of new DNA for cell turnover. So if you're taking a drug that inhibits vitamin B12, you prevent these cells from being able to replicate new cells. So what ends up happening is these cells, they live longer than 2 to 7 days. They get old. And as they get old, they start to lose more of their function. And again, that's going to allow for more breaching of these tight junctions, and it's going to allow for a greater degree of leaky gut. Vitamin B12 deficiency is actually one of the most common nutritional problems I see in patients with grain-based issues or with gluten sensitivity. And it's because gluten itself can damage the stomach, the area of the stomach that is responsible for absorbing B12 or helping with the absorption of B12. Let me draw you another picture here. And on that note, I would say that B12, of all the nutritional deficiencies I see in the clinic, it's probably present in 95+% of patients with gluten sensitivity. So sometimes people ask me if I could only take supplements, you know, to get the best effect, and I didn't have a test, and that there wasn't a test that was telling me I was deficient, but I just wanted to do my best guess. My best guess for you would be take B12, and simply because it's such a common deficiency in the patients with these issues. And so let me kind of show you. I'll draw you a picture of how this works. So here's the esophagus. As we come up here, this is the mouth, and then the stomach is here, and the small intestine is here. And so the stomach is lined by a special layer of cells, similar to your GI tract lower down. And these cells are called parietal cells, parietal. And what they do, they have a job to do. And a lot of you are asking about acid and heartburn and apple cider vinegar and things of that nature. So this might help answer some of those questions too. The parietal cells are what are responsible for secreting acid. And they're also responsible for making this substance called IF. IF is intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor. Now, why is that important? B12 comes through when we eat meat. You don't get B12 in adequate quantities. If you're on a vegetarian diet, it's really hard to get B12 without supplementation. It's hard to get enough of it. Some people will use like yeast extract, which can contain B12. Some people will use algae or mushrooms, which can contain some, but not really enough of the bioavailable type of B12 to keep your nervous system and your heart healthy. So understand that meat is probably the best source of B12. Meat, eggs, dairy can contain it too, but if you're avoiding dairy, that takes that out of the equation. So what happens is meat and B12 are kind of intrinsically attached. So when you eat them, they're connected. And the first thing that happens is the acid, okay, will break the B12 off of the meat. So we'll call that step one. The acid breaks the B12 and the meat apart, separates them, splits them apart. Step two, the intrinsic factor will then come in and it will pick up the B12. Okay, it'll encapsulate the B12. And then from there, it will shuttle the B12 down into your small intestine. And that's where it gets absorbed into your blood. And so step 2/step 3. And if you're eating gluten and grain, one of the side effects of eating gluten, one of the areas of gluten-induced damage happens in the GI tract. We can get damage to these cells. And so you're damaging these parietal cells with gluten, and that reduces your ability to produce acid and intrinsic factor, which reduces step 1, 2, and 3, which makes it very hard to get adequate B12, even though you might be eating plenty of meat. And the other thing that can happen is gluten can also damage the area of the small intestine that is responsible for absorbing the majority of B12. That area is called the ileum, and it's the section of the ileum that connects to the large intestine. That's an area that's notorious for taking damage from gluten in patients with gluten sensitivity. So if you've been eating gluten for years and you've got this issue going on, this is a very strong likelihood. A B12 deficiency is a very strong likelihood for you. And so, you know, I know I kind of went way off on a tangent because the question originally was, do antidepressants suppress leaky gut healing? And the answer is as they reduce B12, let's talk a little bit about the function of B12. B12 is necessary to produce the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is the insulation that coats your nerves in your brain and coats the nerves in your body. And B12 deficiency, the #1 symptom of B12 deficiency is depression. So if you're taking a drug to treat depression and the drug that you're taking reduces vitamin B12 and vitamin B12 deficiency causes depression, and you're eating gluten and not absorbing the B12 in your diet, you can end up severely depressed with severe neurological damage, which is, very similar to the story of the patient I just showed you. And so, yes, to answer your question, yes, antidepressants can affect your healing, okay? And gluten can cause B12 problems. I'm gonna put up a link for you too on B12. It's the most common supplement. Again, it's the most common supplement that I use in the clinic with patients who have this history of gluten sensitivity, and probably one of the most effective at correcting chronic brain fog and memory problems and low levels of energy, because B12 deficiency, not only is it important to recover your nerve sheath and to support your nervous system, it's also important for you to be able to have mature red blood cells. And so what happens with B12 deficiencies, you can develop an anemia, and it's not the same kind of anemia as an iron deficiency anemia. It's a different form of anemia, and it leads to reduced oxygen to your brain. And that's why a deficiency can cause all kinds of brain fog and memory issues. So again, if those are parts of your problem, if you find you can't think clearly, you can't recall clearly, you don't have adequate memory, you have a lot of brain fog, you can't concentrate, and you're gluten sensitive, and you've been eating gluten, there's a very, very strong likelihood that you have a vitamin B12 deficiency. Now, what I just showed you, if this mechanism is damaged, if these cells are damaged and haven't healed yet, if this area of the small intestine is damaged and hasn't healed yet, you can take B12 all you want and it's not going to do much. So the way that you want to take B12 is you want to take it in a sublingual form. In other words, I like to use a lozenge. I've actually developed a lozenge that absorbs through your cheeks so that we bypass the damaged areas in the stomach and in the small intestine. So if you're doing that, if you're taking that particular kind of form and you've got that damage, you don't have to worry about whether or not it's getting in your body. Okay. So hopefully that was helpful for several of the questions that were coming through. I tried to connect a number of the different questions that were coming through and answer them in an elaborate way that would give you a solution. So the next follow-up question is, what's the safe dose of vitamin B12? 5,000 to 10,000 micrograms. If you're using my B12, which is a lot of B12s contain sweeteners that are derived from corn. I had to go to great painstaking efforts to find non-corn derived things to put in my B12 so that it would taste okay, that you could suck on and still absorb properly. But the safe dose is 5,000 to 10,000 micrograms, which if you're using my brand, that would be 1 to 2 capsules a day. And with that, make sure that you're take it before 4 p.m. because some people report if they take it after 4, that it keeps them awake at night and they have a hard time going to sleep. And that's because it can help you with your energy production. So again, 5,000 to 10,000 micrograms. Okay, let's see. We got some more questions coming through. Kimberly, thanks for your comment. Can't wait to get your copy of No Grain, No Pain. Hate being in Australia, have to wait longer than others. I know, but just so you know, Kimberly, we signed a deal. The book is going to be published in Australia. I think it's Penguin who's putting that together. So there's definitely a copy. There's copies coming to Australia. There's copies also coming to New Zealand. There's copies coming to China and Germany. So we have a lot of foreign rights deals that are coming. And so I'll let you guys know if more come, if you're needing it in a different language or if you're in a different part of the world. We're hoping to get this thing translated into every language and get it into the hands of every person in every country, because the information in the book is just that powerful. Okay. Veronica's asking, what causes the feeling that food is stuck in the esophagus? Usually esophageal spasm. If you're eating food you're allergic to, you're sometimes one of your first and most innate instincts, and it's not you doing it voluntarily, it's your esophagus saying, we don't like that, and it will constrict. It's actually trying to induce a vomiting mechanism, but it's not quite being successful at it. So esophageal spasm is oftentimes a food allergy, eating something that you shouldn't be, and it's just your body's way of telling you stop it. Now, other reasons why esophageal spasms might occur, there are a number of different reasons. Some people have goiters, which is a growth on the thyroid, and it'll push into the esophagus, and it can create a tightening or a constricting in the throat, so that when you get food in there and there's a goiter pushing in, it feels like a tightening. and just mainly it's a space occupying issue. So you might have your doctor check you for a goiter and see if there's not a thyroid goiter that's putting pressure in on your esophagus. Okay. Jill, a chiropractor told me that I had vitamin B12. That I had vitamin B12 that was being stored in my liver after being tested for it. I was found I had a level of 1400. Is it still being utilized in my body, or is there any way to get it out of my liver and into the rest of my body? I'm afraid to take vitamin B now. Okay, well, I don't know how he would have been able to tell you that it's being stored in your liver definitively. Not that your liver doesn't store vitamin B12. Your liver does store vitamin B12. But if your serum levels were at 1400, that doesn't mean a whole lot. The serum value of vitamin B12 can change from day to day. If you eat a steak, which is higher in B12, it can change. If you take B12 lozenges, the level in your serum can go up quite a bit, quite quickly, even above what the lab is considering to be a normal level. Serum values of vitamin B12 are not an indicator for vitamin B12 toxicity. They're not a good measure, not a good indicator. So I wouldn't be too concerned over a level of 1400 of vitamin B12 in the blood. If you were my patient, I wouldn't be concerned about having you take B12, but I wouldn't also guess at you taking B12. I'd actually run a type of test where I was measuring your intracellular B12 levels so that I knew whether or not the B12 was getting from your blood into your cells. That's actually a more accurate way of knowing whether or not that B12 is working, because sometimes B12 won't get into your cells, and that could be because you're taking the wrong kind. It could be because you're taking the wrong form. So there are a lot of different factors there. Again, I would have ask your chiropractor if he's familiar with the SpectraCell labs, and ask him if he'll run that test on you. If he's familiar with it, he shouldn't have a problem with running it on you, and get back your intracellular B12 level, and that'll give you a much better accurate representation of whether or not you need to supplement with it. Okay. Rachel, my 9-year-old has juvenile dermatomyositis. Have you seen many patients with this autoimmune condition? If so, have you seen good results with your treatment? Yes, absolutely. So dermatomyositis is actually near and dear to my heart. Many of you may know this already, and many of you may not, but I actually began the early part of my career working in the VA hospital in the rheumatology department. And so lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and dermatomyositis and scleroderma and myalgias and fibromyalgias, those were some of the more common conditions that we would see. Psoriatic arthritis, psoriasis, spondyloarthropathies. So these are all just different forms of autoimmune arthritis and autoimmune soft tissue disease. Dermatomyositis responds extremely well. As a matter of fact, Sally, let's cut to Shanna's story, because I think Rachel, watching this story is going to be very powerful for you. You don't have to have juvenile dermatomyositis to have an effect or have a good impact with diet change. I mean, whether you're an adult or whether you're a child, the diet and the protocols work equally well. And I want to share that story with you now. So let's just take a minute and let's push that story, put that story up, Sally, and let everybody. Okay, so we're back again. So again, just another powerful testimonial story of diet change and lifestyle change and overcoming autoimmune, not only autoimmune skin dysfunction, skin disorder, but autoimmune musculoskeletal disease as well. Okay, let's jump on a few more questions here. Let's see. It looks like a question coming in about whether or not potatoes, sweet potatoes, and white potatoes, in terms of whether they're safe or whether they're not safe. And in the no grain, no pain protocol, understand that nightshades, a family of vegetables called nightshades, we actually put those on the no list in phase 2 of the no grain, no pain protocol because so many people react to nightshades, especially with joint arthritis and joint pain. So let's say if you especially if you're suffering with a form of joint or muscle pain, and you're already grain free and you're not responding, nightshade is definitely something I'd recommend you cut out. Therefore, no white potatoes. Sweet potatoes, on the other hand, are a different matter altogether. Sweet potatoes are not part of the nightshade family. They don't have the same chemical compounds. They don't tend to cause that irritation, aggravation, and inflammation of joints and muscles. So they're on the safe list. So again, that's a kind of a synopsis of potatoes. But again, everybody's unique and different too. So in my clinic, we test individual people to see whether or not certain things are the right thing for them to eliminate or not, as opposed to just trying to guess. Okay. Okay, so I've gotten this question. I got this question on the webinar last night a number of times and just didn't have time to get into it, but it's about eye floaters. So let's put that out there. Eye floaters, what can we do to eliminate them? It depends on the type of eye floater. There are some eye floaters that are actually somewhat remnant forms of migraine headache. And there are a number of different things that can contribute to that. And so one of the simplest things is to look for, and this may or may not be your problem, is just simple dehydration. Dehydration can contribute to eye floaters. High blood sugar is probably one of the most common reasons why we're going to see eye floaters. Eye floaters are actually, they're postulated or they're speculated to be proteins, glycated proteins that are floating, and so then they kind of appear in the eye, in the visual field. So you might have your doctor check you for blood sugar dysfunction, blood sugar abnormalities. That would be one avenue to investigate or to look for. And again, I said before, they sometimes can be remnants of migraine headache, meaning that if you're having a headache and migraine conditions, there are a number of different reasons why that can happen. Magnesium deficiency, vitamin B12, CoQ10, vitamin B2 deficiency, food allergies. So there are a gambit of different things that can actually lead to or contribute to that particular symptom. So hopefully that's helpful for you and gives you some avenues to pursue and investigate. Are yam potatoes versus sweet potatoes acceptable? Yam and sweet potatoes, yeah, they're both acceptable. And there are a variety of different kinds of sweet potatoes. There's jewel sweet potatoes and garnet and Japanese sweet potatoes. Those are all also acceptable. Okay. Do I recommend that nuts be soaked and sprouted? No, not necessarily. Part of it depends on the status of your gut. Part of it depends on whether you have a problem with oxalates and phytates. Some people do, some people don't. But generally speaking, no, it's not a general recommendation that nuts be soaked and sprouted, although some people do better with them when they soak and sprout them. So, but it's not necessarily something that everyone needs to do. Okay. Let's run to another poll here. I'm going to pull up another poll. I'd like to just get a feel, because there's a concept that before we cut out tonight, there's one more concept that I want to discuss with you. So if you're taking medications, just like to get some feedback for where you're at in as far as your medication use and whether or not you're on them or whether or not you're not on them. because there's a very important concept that you should understand. I talk about it pretty aggressively in the book, No Grain, No Pain, just simply because the average medical doctor who has less than 7 hours of nutritional experience or classroom knowledge and education spends all day prescribing medications to 20, 30 patients a day, but has no insight or no knowledge about this concept known as drug-induced nutritional deficiencies. And I touched on it a little bit earlier in the diagram here, where we talked about vitamin B12 being caused, deficiency being caused by antidepressant medications. And so that's just one example of a drug-induced nutritional deficiency. So there's almost half of you are taking some form of medication. So I think it merits at least a brief conversation. There are a number of classes of medication that will destroy your nutritional status. And I'm going to talk about some of the more common ones, so that hopefully we're hitting what most of you are using, and you can go further and get this investigated. So, blood pressure medications, depending on the kind of blood pressure medication that you're on, there are different classes. There's diuretics and ACE inhibitors, but some of the more common deficiencies that we'll see with blood pressure medication: magnesium, potassium, zinc, B vitamins, especially vitamin B1. If you're on a diuretic like furosemide or hydrochlorothiazide, very, very common to cause B vitamin, especially vitamin B1 deficiency. So this class of medication, the blood pressure, and another one is CoQ10. Okay, now cholesterol lowering medication will block CoQ10 as well, but also vitamin D. And then we also have another really common, the diabetic medications like metformin and glucophage. Those are going to block folate, which is vitamin B9. They're going to block vitamin B12, and they're going to also block CoQ10. Okay, and then there's antacids. I'm going to draw in the middle here. There's antacids. We talked a little bit about this earlier. Antacid medications block magnesium and calcium, and they block vitamin B12 and protein and some of the other minerals like selenium, etc. So these are some of the more common medications. Antibiotics, another one that many of you may have taken. Antibiotics will block. That's a C, not a K. I was writing vitamin K in my head ahead of time. Vitamin K and biotin, which is also known as vitamin B8. So again, some of the more common medications that are prescribed for a number of different conditions, and some of the more common drugs that those medications will cause deficiencies in that you should be aware of. Now, let's talk a little bit about the irony of this. If we're trying to lower blood pressure, but we take a medication that also causes a depletion of some of these nutrients, understand that magnesium deficiency causes high blood pressure. CoQ10 deficiency causes high blood pressure. Vitamin B1 deficiency causes congestive heart failure. Zinc deficiency causes a breakdown of your muscle tissue. Remember, your heart's a muscle, so it can affect your muscle. Potassium deficiency causes high blood pressure. So does that make sense to you that we would treat a disease and in hopes to try to reduce heart disease? As a rule, that's what we're trying to do, is reduce the risk of developing a stroke or a heart attack, but we're inducing all these deficiencies that actually can contribute to heart disease. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to justify doing that for somebody's entire life, just because. It makes better sense to find out why the blood pressure is high in the first place, which is the question and the conversation you should be having with that doctor. Again, cholesterol drugs. Cholesterol drugs also designed to, just like blood pressure medications, to reduce the risk of stroke and heart attack. CoQ10 deficiency causes heart disease. Vitamin D deficiency causes muscle loss and heart disease. If you lose your muscle and you develop muscle weakness, you can't exercise. And if you can't exercise, your cholesterol goes up and your blood pressure goes up. So you kind of see the irony in some of this. And the same thing with diabetes. Diabetes medications also block CoQ10, which can cause muscle weakness and can elevate your blood pressure. Again, If you damage your muscles and you can't exercise and your biggest problem is diabetes, then you're going to end up just chasing your tail. So a lot of these medications that cause vitamin and mineral deficiencies don't really do you any favors in the long run. It's not that you can't use the medications in the short term while you're making diet adjustments, while you're making meaningful lifestyle changes. But if your doctor hasn't had a conversation with you about specific meaningful lifestyle changes, then it's time to ask the tough questions. It's time to say, look, you want me to take these for the rest of my life, but you won't really tell me why I need them, and you don't tell me about the consequences of using them. It can be very, very frustrating at the end of the day. So again, I think it's a concept that you should all understand to a great degree, because even if some of you aren't on medications, you might have parents or family members or siblings that are taking those medications, and I think it's a message that deserves sharing, so that other people can get educated as well. Okay, we're running down. I'm going to answer just a couple more questions before we call it a night. Want to go ahead and put up, if you haven't already gotten your copy or ordered your copy of No Grain, No Pain, Sally, would you put up that link? We've got a really special bonus for anybody who's ordering No Grain, No Pain. And I want to make sure that if you're going to order a copy that you get that special bonus. There's several $100s worth of coupons. There's an extra 15 recipes. I've got some exercise videos for you as well. I got a leaky gut manual. It's about 60 pages, which will tell you how to conquer leaky gut, and in a little bit more detail than what we were able to cover in tonight. And so anyway, I'm going to make sure that that link is up there for you guys, and let's get a couple of other questions answered. Kimberly's asking, what's my opinion of the anti-nuclear antibody blood test? You need your GP giving you along with a list of vitamins and minerals and heavy metals. Any nuclear antibodies are, they're used to try to detect autoimmune disease. Particularly, they're associated with lupus and mixed connective tissue disorders that are autoimmune in nature. The test itself, there's nothing wrong with the test. I mean, if it's positive, it's definitely positive, but it has a high tendency to come back false negative in people with autoimmune soft tissue or arthritic diseases. But the test is it's not a definitive marker. In other words, it wouldn't be my first choice. If I were trying to determine why a person has an autoimmune disease, I would look at those 4 things we talked about and discussed at the beginning of the conversation tonight. Because if you already know that you have an autoimmune disease, what good is it to continue to run tests that show us that you have an autoimmune disease if we already know that you have an autoimmune disease? Let's find out why you have an autoimmune disease. In other words, let's find out why and not what, because if we know why, we can address the underlying reasons, and we can get the what part, which is the positive ANA antibody test, we can get that part to go away. So it's not that it's a bad blood test, it's just not something that I would recommend and use as definitive in terms of how I would go about thinking about treatment. Okay. There was another question I wanted to get to. So Amy's asking that, so her question is, my mom currently is only about to tolerate a liquid diet. Anytime she tries to eat solid food, she bloats out, gas, and pain. What should her first steps be, and what should her GI doctor be looking for? Unfortunately, she will only see a doctor that accepts her insurance, which are generally not NDs. Well, you don't need an ND. There's a lot of good functional medicine doctors that are MDs and NDs and DCs and DOs. I mean, the reality is this: if she's not able to tolerate solid food, the standard doctor is probably going to run a scope if they haven't already, and make sure that that there's no type of ulceration or no type of gastrointestinal inflammation or damage that's obvious. Beyond that, the testing that's done in that type of environment is relatively limited, and generally the approach is going to be to put her on some type of antispasmodic agent or some type of antacid to make an assumption that she's got heartburn and that that's her symptom, or to put her on a drug to treat IBS. None of those things are going to be a solution. If she's not tolerating real food, it's probably got a lot to do with her lack of her inability or her incapacity to produce digestive enzymes, potentially even that she's not producing adequate stomach acid. She might be on a litany of other medications that influence or interfere with her ability and her digestive processes. A lot of drugs affect gut motility, affect the way we secrete digestive enzymes, affect the way we make stomach acid. So, I mean, there's a lot of factors there, Amy. I'm sorry I can't be more specific, but I would maybe start. honestly, I would try to convince your mom to go see a doctor who can actually help her, because just because her insurance will pay for the doctor doesn't mean that it's paying for something that's valuable. A lot of times people say, well, my insurance won't cover it, therefore I won't do it. And that's where they get stuck until they become so sick that then they end up with no other option but to go find a doctor. And I would say, don't let her wait around until she gets so sick that that happens. If you can do anything to convince her to get in to see somebody who's going to really, really search for the meaning behind why those problems are occurring, that's what I would suggest. Because again, in the standard GI office, if it's not a functional medicine GI doctor, you're going to get the standard scope, maybe an upper, maybe a lower GI, and you may get a pH capsule that she's got to swallow. They may do a barium swallow test. That all those tests are going to be largely non-diagnostic to try to determine why that problem is there. And they might do one other thing. I mean, this is one test that she can't have done in a standard doctor's office, and that's measuring. It's a breath test, and it's called a SIBO test, SIBO, and that SIBO stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So she may have a bacterial infection or bacterial overgrowth that's hindering her digestive processes, and that would probably be one of the main diagnostic things that could be done in a standard office, that a standard GI doctor might know about, but not even all standard GI doctors know about testing for SIBO. So again, I would try to get her to visit with a functional medicine doctor before she gets herself into a bigger bind, because the longer she's on a liquid diet and being malnourished, the more that's going to affect her nutritional status, the more that's going to wear and tear her body down. And the more that happens, she's going to get more and more symptoms that are associated with malnutrition, and it's just going to be a downward spiral. And I hate to bring you that message, and I hate to say it that way, but I can't give you anything but the honest truth. So for you. Okay. Well, I think we'll take one more question before we call it a night. We've gone a little bit over the time that I had set aside to do this, but the questions just keep coming. So let's go ahead and answer one more. Sodium sensitivity, make me very much high pressure and low. I'm not, you know what, Herta, I'm not quite sure I understand your question. There might be a language barrier there. Why don't you email Glutenology, and if you can put that question and reword that question, we may be able to get you back a better answer. Anna's got a question on calcification tendinitis. Yeah, very much. Calcification tendinitis is almost always a vitamin D deficiency, Anna. What happens with vitamin D deficiency? Vitamin D tells your intestines to absorb calcium, and if your vitamin D levels are low, then your thymus gland, which is next to your thyroid gland, actually will tell your bone to release calcium, because you're not absorbing it from your diet. Your bloodstream has to be very tightly regulated with calcium, and if your vitamin D levels are low, your thymus gland can get out of control and sometimes pull too much calcium from your bone, and then that calcium can end up being stored in your tendons, because your body is then trying to deal with an overburdensome level of calcium that's being spit out from the bone. So make sure you check your vitamin D level. If you're dealing with calcifying tendons, your vitamin D level should be at least 50 on a standard test where the range is generally 20 to 100. It should be at least 50, and preferably somewhere between 70 and 100. But that would be one of the first things that I would look at in terms of why it's actually happening. Vitamin D deficiency is very, very common. Okay, so again, that link is up for you guys on, let's put that link back up on the book so that people, again, know where to get that book bonus. I'm going to wrap up tonight, and I want to really encourage you, if you haven't already picked up your copy of No Grain, No Pain, I want to really encourage you to do that. You buying a copy helps support my mission and helps me do events and helps me do things like this. My clinic keeps me super busy. I don't get to do a lot of these kinds of things. This book has been very exciting. I'm super excited to be able to share this information with you guys and with the rest of the world. And I greatly appreciate any support that you can give in helping us spread this message. And by buying the book, what you're doing is you're helping it reach more people, and you're helping it get into more hands. So if you've not bought your copy, please do. Grab those bonuses while you're at it. And if you know somebody who can benefit from the book, buy it for them as a gift. Maybe they're not ready to take in all of this information, but maybe that book is a first step in the right direction for them to have a life-changing, health recovering type of event. So I want to thank you all for attending tonight and taking time out of your evening to be here with me and to spend an evening with me. And we will see you next time on the next video or the next podcast. You can also always get more information at glutenfreesociety.org, and you can also learn more about my clinic at drpeterosborne.com. Thanks so much and have a great evening.